My father denied me college money but asked me for a loan for my stepsister. Years later, my grandfather gave me his house in secret, and now I charge him rent and split the money with the women he betrayed. I'm 33 years old. I work in finance. And honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because what I discovered about my father a few months ago basically made me rethink my entire life. Like, the whole relationship I had with him since I was a kid. And it's not just that he was a bad father, which he was, but it turns out he was also a liar, a cheater, and basically a walking fraud who had been playing all of us for years. But I guess I should start from the beginning. When all of this started taking shape, my parents divorced when I was 10 years old. And honestly, it was a relief because the house was a constant battlefield. My mom, Susan, worked all the time as an administrator at a logistics company, and my dad, Thomas, was always with his businesses that never really took off completely. The problem was they didn't know how to divorce without using me as a messenger, you know? Like, my mom would tell me, "Tell your father I need this month's check." And my dad would respond, "Tell your mother to get a better lawyer." I was 10 years old, damn it. I shouldn't have been mediating financial disputes between adults. But, well, that's how things were for years. And I basically learned to navigate between two houses, two completely different lives. The thing is, when I was 15, my dad remarried Victoria, who honestly was a super kind and caring woman, the complete opposite of him. Victoria had a daughter from her first marriage, Claire, who was like 7 years old at the time. And from the beginning, I tried to get along with her, because it wasn't her fault to be in the middle of all this family mess. My dad lived in my grandfather Arthur's house, who had basically lent him that house because Thomas could never really establish himself financially, always with one foot in and one foot out of different projects that promised a lot and delivered little. My grandfather Arthur and my grandmother Elizabeth were always my refuge when things got difficult. Especially Grandma, who let me stay at her house when I couldn't stand the drama in either of the other two anymore. Fast forward to when I turned 18. I had been saving money from part-time jobs during high school, and both my parents had told me they were going to help me with college, that they had funds saved for that. My mom kept her word. She gave me everything she had saved, which wasn't a fortune, but it was what she could. And I thanked her a ton because I know she made real sacrifices to have that money. But when it came time to talk to my dad about his contribution, he dropped the bomb on me. He told me, literally, "Nathan, I can't give you that money. I used it for family expenses. Claire needs things. Sophia was just born. My half-sister had been born that year. And I simply don't have the money I promised." I just sat there in his living room, looking at him, thinking, "Are you really telling me this right now, when I've already been accepted to university?" And the worst part is he didn't look even a little bit sorry. Like, it was as if it was the most normal thing in the world to break a years-long promise just like that out of nowhere. I ended up paying for my university with student loans, scholarships, and working full-time while studying, which was brutal, but I did it. I graduated in finance, got a good job in another city, and honestly tried to keep my distance from my dad because every time I talked to him, I felt like he drained my energy. My mom and I kept regular contact. She was always super practical and direct with me, gave me work advice, life advice, and never fed me weird stories. With Victoria and Claire, I also kept some contact because I genuinely liked them, especially Claire, who by then was already a pretty cool teenager. Sophia, my half-sister, was still very young, but the few times I saw her, she seemed like a sweet kid. And then, when I was 25 years old, I got a call from my dad. We hadn't talked in months, maybe almost a year, and suddenly, he calls me, saying he needs to talk to me urgently about something important. I thought, well, maybe he's finally going to apologize for everything. Maybe he matured a bit, who knows. We agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between our cities, and that's when he dropped the second bomb on me. He told me that Claire was about to enter university, that he had saved money for her education for years, but that he had to use all that money when Sophia, who by then was like 7 years old, had a serious medical emergency, something with her heart, and that the hospital bills had been astronomical. He told me, "I need you to lend me money for Claire's college. You're working well. You have a good salary, and I can't let her lose her opportunity to study because of this." I sat there, drinking my coffee, thinking about all the layers of cynicism this conversation had. This man had denied me the money he promised for my university, supposedly using it for his new family, and now he was asking me to pay for my stepsister's college because he had used her money for something else. And the worst part is I felt sorry for Claire because she wasn't to blame for having a father like that. So I told him, okay, I'm going to help Claire, but with one condition. You have to be honest with Victoria about what happened with her daughter's money. You can't keep hiding this information from your wife. He got super defensive and told me that was between him and Victoria, that I shouldn't get involved in his marriage. But I stood firm. I told him, either you're honest with her, or I'll tell her myself, because I'm not going to be an accomplice to another one of your lies. I don't know if he actually told Victoria everything or just an edited version, but eventually I agreed to help with Claire's college. We established that I would lend him a certain amount monthly during her 4 years of university, and he would sign legal documents promising to pay me back everything with interest once his financial situation improved. Spoiler alert, that never happened. So the years went by. I kept sending money for Claire, who by the way graduated with honors and now has a good job, so at least that money went to something positive. When I was 29 years old, I met Farida at a work conference. She's of Afghan origin, second generation, works in technology, and basically is the smartest, funniest, and most beautiful person I've ever met in my life. We fell in love pretty quickly, and after 2 years, we got engaged. I was super excited to tell my family, and my mom's reaction was great. She adored Farida immediately. Victoria and Claire were also super warm with her. But my dad, oh God. My dad decided this was the perfect moment to show his true face again. When I introduced him to Farida, he was polite in person, but afterwards he called me and told me he didn't approve of this relationship, that Farida came from a very different culture, that he wasn't sure this was a good idea, and basically threw a bunch of comments at me that bordered on racist without saying the exact words. I told him his opinion didn't matter to me, that I was going to marry Farida anyway, and that if he had a problem with that, he could simply not attend the wedding. He got really angry, started saying I was an ungrateful son, that after everything he had done for me, what exactly? I was thinking. I was disrespecting him like this. The conversation ended very badly, and we didn't talk for months. But well, I continued with the wedding plans, and since we wanted to do something reasonably big, I started saving money and making preparations. The wedding was planned for when I was 33 years old, basically last year. So, like 6 months before the wedding, I decided to make one last attempt to have a decent relationship with my dad. I called him and asked if we could talk. And in that conversation, I mentioned that while I could pay for most of the wedding, it would help if he paid me back at least part of the money I had lent him for Claire, since she had already graduated a while ago. His response left me frozen. He told me, Nathan, I'm not going to give you that money now, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be able to pay you back. Besides, given that I don't support this marriage, it doesn't seem right to contribute financially to something I don't agree with. That's when something in me broke. Like, I literally felt like years of accumulated frustration exploded all at once. This man had used me as his mediator when I was a child, had denied me the help he promised for my education, had manipulated me into paying for my stepsister's education with false promises of repayment, and now was refusing to keep his word because he didn't like who I was going to marry. And the worst part was he was still living in my grandfather's house, without paying rent, while I had to fight for everything in my life. The hypocrisy was unbearable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning in bed thinking about everything, about every broken promise, every manipulation, every time he chose his comfort over his responsibility as a father. And I decided enough was enough. If he was going to play dirty, I could too. So, I sat at my computer and wrote the most detailed and devastating message I've ever written in my life. It was like a complete audit of all the times Thomas had failed as a father, as a husband, as a human being. I included dates, amounts of money, specific promises he had broken, all documented with the emails and messages I had saved for years. And I sent it not just to him, but to the whole family. Victoria, Claire, my mom, my grandparents, basically anyone who had a right to know what kind of person he really was. The response was immediate and chaotic. My mom called me and told me that, although she understood my frustration, maybe it had been a bit excessive. Victoria wrote me a long message saying she needed time to process all of this. Claire called me crying, saying she didn't know her college fund had been used like that. But the most important response came from my grandfather, Arthur. He called me the next day and told me, "Nathan, I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago. It turns out that when Sophia had her medical emergency, I paid all the hospital bills. Your father asked me for help, and I gave it because Sophia is my granddaughter, and I wasn't going to let her suffer because of money problems. But that means your father lied about having used Claire's fund to pay for those medical expenses. I don't know where that money went, but it definitely didn't go to the hospital." I was paralyzed listening to this. I mean, my dad hadn't just been irresponsible with money, hadn't just broken promises, but he had invented a complete story about using Claire's college fund for a medical emergency, when in reality my grandfather had paid for everything. Where the hell was that money then? My grandfather continued, and told me something that to this day seems surreal to me. He told me, "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've made a decision. The house where your father lives, technically it's mine. I've only been lending it to him all these years. I'm going to transfer that property to your name as a wedding gift. Your father can continue living there if you allow it, but the house will be yours. It's time for him to face consequences for his actions." When my dad found out about this, he completely lost his mind. He started sending me desperate emails, text messages at all hours, calls that I didn't answer, begging me to convince Grandpa to change his mind. He told me this was cruel, that I was destroying the family, that how could I do this to him? The irony was incredible. You know what I mean? This man who had spent years destroying my trust and financial stability now felt like a victim because he was finally facing real consequences. I didn't respond to a single message. I blocked his number, blocked his email, and focused on my wedding. Farida and I got married in a beautiful ceremony. My mom was there, radiant and proud. Victoria and Claire attended, although you could tell Victoria was processing a lot of complex emotions. My grandparents were there, and Grandpa Arthur gave me a super long hug and whispered to me, "You did the right thing exposing him. I should have done it years ago." My dad obviously didn't attend, and honestly his absence made everything lighter and happier. We went on our honeymoon to Japan for 3 weeks, and I blocked all social media and forms of family contact because I wanted to enjoy that time with my wife without drama. When we returned from the honeymoon, I had like 50 messages from Victoria asking me to talk urgently. I called her, and what she told me was the cherry on top of this whole nightmare. It turns out Victoria, after reading my detailed message and talking to Grandpa Arthur about the medical payments, decided to do her own investigation into the family finances. And she discovered that Thomas had been having an affair for the last 2 years. Not only that, but the woman he had the affair with was blackmailing him, threatening to tell Victoria everything if he didn't pay her regular amounts of money. And there was the mystery of Claire's college fund solved. My father had used that money, and probably much more, to pay off his blackmailing mistress and keep his double life a secret. Victoria told me all this with a super calm voice, but I could feel the contained rage behind every word. She told me she had already moved out of the house with Sophia, that she had started divorce proceedings, and that Claire had also cut contact with Thomas. She asked me if I was really going to charge Thomas rent for living in my house, because, yes, the property transfer had already been completed legally, and I told her yes, that I was definitely going to do it. In fact, I decided to charge him a fair market rent for a house that size in that area and split the money equally between my mom and Victoria as a kind of compensation for all the years of lies and manipulation they had both suffered. Thomas tried to refuse to pay rent, saying this was illegal, that I couldn't kick him out just like that. I sent him a message through my lawyer explaining he had 2 options: pay rent monthly or vacate the property in 60 days according to the law. He chose to pay, probably because he has nowhere else to go that he can afford. Every month, when that payment arrives in my account, I split it and send it to my mom and Victoria. My mom uses that extra money to travel, something she always wanted to do but could never afford. Victoria is saving it for Sophia's future, and also for her own emergency fund while she stabilizes after the divorce. Claire and I have developed a closer relationship after all this. She feels super guilty about the money I spent on her education, but I've told her 1,000 times it's not her fault, that she was a child when all this started, and that I'm genuinely happy she was able to study and graduate. She's now helping Victoria financially too, which is a nice gesture on her part. Sophia, who is now 15 years old, is confused by everything obviously, but Victoria is handling the situation with her in the healthiest way possible. Not bad-mouthing Thomas, but being honest about the reasons for the divorce. As for Thomas, I know from Victoria that he's living alone in that house, working at whatever he's working on now, paying his monthly rent religiously, probably out of fear of being homeless, and basically isolated from almost the entire family. Grandpa Arthur doesn't speak to him anymore. Grandma Elizabeth doesn't either. My mom never spoke to him again, after learning the full extent of his lies. I certainly have no intention of re-establishing contact with him, at least not in the near future, maybe never. The weird thing is, I don't feel the kind of vengeful satisfaction I thought I would feel. I mean, yes, there's a part of me that feels vindicated, that feels like there's finally justice after years of being used and manipulated. But there's also a strange sadness, like, this is my father, this person who was supposed to be there for me, and instead he built an entire life based on lies and betrayal. Sometimes I wonder if he was ever genuine with me, if any of the good moments I remember from my childhood were real or just part of his act. Farida has been incredible through all this. She comes from a super close-knit family with strong values, so all this drama seems like another world to her. But she's never judged me or made me feel bad about how I handled things. In fact, she was the one who encouraged me to write that exposing message when I was doubting whether to do it or not. She told me, "Nathan, people like your father only change when they face real consequences, and if you don't set boundaries now, he's going to keep manipulating you for the rest of your life." And she was right. Completely right. Grandpa Arthur told me a few weeks ago that he doesn't regret giving me the house, that in fact he should have done it years earlier. He told me that when Thomas was young, he was different, ambitious, but also irresponsible, and that he and Grandma always thought he would eventually mature. But instead of maturing, Thomas just became more skilled at hiding his flaws and manipulating the people around him. My grandfather feels guilty for having allowed this to continue for so long, for having been a shield between Thomas and the consequences of his actions. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he was just trying to help his son, but I can see it weighs on him. Right now I'm focused on building my own family with Farida. We're looking to buy our own house. Ironic that I already own a property but live renting in another city. But well, maybe start thinking about having kids in the next few years. I keep regular contact with my mom, who's still my rock, with Victoria and the girls, and with my grandparents. I've built a chosen family that's functional and honest, and that's more valuable to me than any blood connection with someone who never respected that connection. Last week, Victoria told me the divorce was officially finalized. Thomas tried to fight for shared custody of Sophia, but between the evidence of the affair, the financial fraud, and the fact that Sophia herself expressed a preference to live only with her mom, the judge gave Victoria full custody with supervised visits for Thomas. Apparently, Thomas is appealing the decision, which is typical of him, clinging to any minimal illusion of control even when everyone can see he's already lost. I don't know how this story ends because, technically, it's still unfolding. Thomas is still alive, still paying rent in my house, still existing on the periphery of our lives like this uncomfortable reminder of everything that went wrong. Part of me wonders if someday he'll try to truly make amends, if someday he'll have a moment of clarity where he understands the damage he caused. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath waiting for that. People like him rarely change, and I've made peace with that reality. My life is better without him in it. Plain and simple.